Hello. Amazing. Hi, everybody. Um, do you hear me now? Amazing. My name is Cameron, um, and I'm with People's Housing Project, and I'm going to be opening this discussion with Bryan, who's BK. I had the whole intro down, and I didn't have any of it recorded. Amazing. And we kind of want to open this as an open discussion. So we're going to be going through talking points of our topic of volunteerism versus community building. And we really would love just anybody to give any insight they would like to kind of make this a more constructive talk rather than kind of like a lecture. BK, do you want to say anything? No, that's cool. Oh,
Were you asking me?
yeah, if you wanted to say anything just as an intro.
Yeah, no, thank you everybody for being here. If anybody has questions or thoughts or things as they come up, definitely feel free to raise your hand because we are trying to have this be more of like a community discourse. But yeah, I love you all and really appreciate your time and energy. So yeah, without further ado, Slamron, take it away.
Yeah, I really appreciate those who could show up, showing up. It's kind of hard to get to a Zoom meeting and it's hard to just be there for a certain time of a meeting. So I really appreciate that. We're kind of going to intro this with the kind of ills of volunteerism as a concept and as a construction. And in order to do that, we kind of have to broaden the scope of volunteering to be encompassing the nonprofit industrial complex. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that before, or kind of like of the nonprofit world, but didn't know that there was a whole kind of complex. And that kind of goes into the ideas of capitalism. And this is going to be a lot of this conversation is going to be around critical theory, um, because it's critical of the systems that we are participating in. So it's going to be under that umbrella. And whenever we talk about the nonprofit industrial complex, it's mainly around the idea that these organizations claim to be nonprofit, but in a lot of ways they do make a profit, or at least the high members at the top do make a margin of profit. And this nonprofit identity is more of a construction to state on tax claims and to not be taxed because it's a community endeavor. But in a lot of ways, it doesn't. And in a lot of ways, it also harms kind of the way in which we are trying to prevent things. One of those ways that nonprofit organizations kind of do that is by not wanting to solve issues of certain things, but trying to mitigate. Because if you're making a profit or if you're kind of serving a purpose in a society, you don't necessarily want to fix it, because if you fix it, then there's no reason to have you anymore. Our organization,
if Greenpeace ever actually saved the rainforest, they wouldn't need to continue existing.
yeah.
So all of these people in these careers have a vested interest in doing just enough to keep their jobs while also making sure the problem perpetuates.
Yep.
One thing I wanted to say about just the nonprofit industrial complex is like the reason why it's called that is it's a term coined in the 70s as part of these analyses of the prison industrial complex. It's considered the other side of the coin of the prison industrial complex, because coming out of the late 60s and radical movements, when you had groups like the Black Panther Party, the system is trying to find ways to shut down dissent. And it has two strategies. The first of which is prison, where the people who cannot be bought off, who refuse to cooperate, and who are lower income and easily targeted, are the people who are locked up over bullshit drug crimes or whatever. And then the other side of that is the professionalization of dissent, where what used to be dissident social movements becomes a series of 501c3s. So you don't work to topple capitalism anymore. You work on women's issues. You don't work to build a decolonial unified movement. You go into Asian American studies. And it becomes a way, and then you can make a, just like Cameron was talking about, you can make a good fucking living doing it. So it becomes a path to a career, and it attracts careerists rather than movementists.
Yeah. The same thing can be kind of applied to like the military industrial complex. The idea is to perpetuate it as an industry, to kind of manufacture it as a need, a constant need that can be bought into and profitized. Now, how volunteers play into it is kind of a little bit more nuanced. It has a little bit less of an overt kind of understanding of being like, oh, well, that's like a for a motivation of perpetuating this as a cause. Volunteers are often kind of accepting the ideas that are perpetuated of volunteering, of doing something as a net good, of doing something for the benefit of others. And this charitability is really taken advantaged by the nonprofit organizations as they are. Think of how many churches will send kind of people over to different places to not just help them and assist with aid, being free labor, but they also kind of serve to what is it like trying to promote the ideas of that church, to promote this ideology, and to continue to perpetuate it, to serve as labor for free, and to kind of push ideology that doesn't fit into the culture that those people could be fitting into. This can be harmful, especially whenever it's usually exported assistance. So we have volunteering that can kind of be good if it's focused within the community, but a lot of times volunteering is focusing without the community. Even if you're focusing in the same area that you live in, you're usually seeing it as exporting a good to others. You're doing it out of the graciousness of your heart, and you're doing it kind of because they need that help. You see them as, and by doing this, you're proposing them as lesser, as needing more, as not being as much as you, by kind of creating this power dynamic of people who have and can, and people who need and do not have. And that is unsustainable. It creates a power dynamic, and it doesn't actually fix the issues that a lot of people believe that they're fixing with volunteering. Um,
And it's
and
very
so,
insidious too, because those big organizations promise you that you're going to be making a difference. Like they don't show up and be like, hey, you're just going to go over here and kind of patronizingly teach English to people who have plenty of English teachers in Peru. Like, so I went and spent, part of the reason I think this is such a good topic is I spent like a month and a half after college on one of these volunteerism trips. Like it wasn't for a Christian thing, but it was like some volunteer international thing where you paid these guys a bunch of money and then you went and worked for free. And you show up in a place, and it's like I spoke Spanish, but you show up in a place where you don't really understand the culture, and everybody there knows you're going to be gone in a month and a half. So there's not really any opportunity to build community out of what you're doing. Yeah, no, 100%. Say like it's a band-aid versus like the actual like, because I had the good fortune of being taken out for drinks by a bunch of the college students I was teaching, and they were basically like, so hey man, you seem like a nice guy who's like really trying to help Peru. Like the best thing you could do for Peru is like fuck off back to America and get the United States to stop fucking up Latin American countries. And it was good advice, because Latin America and South America would be just fucking fine if it wasn't for American imperialism.
yeah, in a lot of ways, we've also create those issues, right? We also create these issues of poverty that kind of suddenly, like, instead of having the government that unilaterally can know who's facing what issues, we instead have it so these people are seen as like, oh, well, they're not caught by the system. And so you have people who see it as a problem. They see it as like, oh, well, the government's not going to step in, so we should step in. And there, it's not a constant like a program. It's not like food stamps where you get it every month. It's a when I feel like it, I'm going to show up. but there's no really commitment. And that kind of commitment is usually focused whenever it goes into a community, whenever we're building and focusing on a community that holds us accountable and holds us to it. We hold ourselves to a community that we're a part of. You can think of it as most people have like family structures where you can't simply abandon your family because you're a part of that as a community, or you have a job and that kind of keeps you within that job. But in the larger scale of America, we don't really have a focus on communities. We don't have a focus on neighbors being neighbors, and we don't have a focus on people kind of helping each other. You know, people having gardens and being like, hey, I have extra food. I don't need it. Or, hey, I'm building this thing. Could you help me? It's a two-person job and I'm one person. We don't really have a focus on that. We instead kind of export these things. You need help moving? Well, then you have to buy and kind of pay for movers. You don't have anybody to help you. You don't have, daycare because that's not universally available. Well, you're going to have to pay somebody because your family it also is becoming smaller. By focusing on a nuclear family, we've made families smaller when we should be focusing on making these things larger. Like, oh, you need help? I can help you because you're important to me. You're a part of my community, and we can band together to help you. But we don't really have like an infrastructure for those sorts of things, and we also don't have that whenever it comes to volunteering. When you give yourself to volunteer, these kind of networks, like they focus on college students, right? There is a lot of college students who are poor, who relatively are only going to college because they believe that it'll give them a better chance of making it out of poverty, or they're in middle class society and their parents went to college, so they kind of are expected to just go. That's the only route that they know. And some of these, a larger portion of these college students, are becoming like houseless. They are facing houselessness. They're living in a car or they're living at their friend's house. And volunteer like organizations and the school expect these students to kind of give their free time as either for credits for school or just because that's the population where they kind of make those demands of like, well, you're a college student, you can do an internship. That's kind of how an economic exploitation of them. But volunteering is also an exploitation that mainly focuses on college students because they're seen as free labor, as free accessible labor for a know who you know kind of thing. And this is uh, bad because those college students that are putting themselves into these organizations aren't really getting anything back because volunteering is a giving thing. It's not a, oh, well, you need something from the volunteer. Well, we don't really work that way. We don't really take care of the volunteers. We just kind of expect them to show up, do what we ask them to do, and then leave. We don't actually care about the stability of volunteering because there's not really that stability in college, anyways. So they drop them, and that's kind of how it works in most of America. Most of the capitalist ideas is pulling people to take as much of their labor or of their value and then kind of dropping them when they suddenly need something back. If you are working a job and you need some time off, you don't get to take that time off. You aren't covered by your job because even though your job may market itself as a family, it's usually not, because it doesn't take care of its workers. And the same thing goes with volunteering. Volunteering doesn't take care of its workers because they're not held, they don't hold the same accountability as a community would. And so whenever we talk about the issues of volunteering, it's not only that volunteering doesn't really help people, that it says that it helps, but it also doesn't help the people that are helping. You can't keep giving and giving without any replenishing. You can't do that. And we are learning that. We're learning with these, the tires of late stage capitalism, that people are giving too much. They're giving their emotional labor, which you're not paid for. They're giving their mental labor, which you're not compensated for, and you're not getting enough. You're not getting anything. And they're exhausted. They're burnt out. People are talking about how burnt out everybody is, and that includes the sphere of um, nonprofits. It includes people being able to give charitably. That we're not getting people who are kind of able to come back because they themselves, they understand marginalization, they understand the effects of capitalism, but they're having a hard time taking care of themselves. And they feel like they're in a position where, well, I have to give anyways. I'm more stable than those who are suffering more than me, so I have to give. So they don't focus themselves And when we talk about revolutionary actions, when we talk about these things, a large part of it is being able to care for yourself. If you throw yourself out, if you throw yourself into this harm for the cause, there's nobody who will be left for the cause to benefit. There's nobody who will be left for the cause to actually uplift. Most of this kind of revolutionary speak should be around empowerment as well as self preservation and community building, and usually also trauma informed community building has that understanding that poverty and that these kind of situations create trauma. I'm sure there's statistics on trauma is like at least one in not one in something. It's a half. At least half of Americans have faced some sort of trauma, traumatic event, anything. And a lot of people don't necessarily know how to deal with that. And kind of coming together and kind of creating these communities is hard when you have that, especially whenever you're incentivized to be individualized. Um, and so, with this kind of framework change, it's a theoretical change, it's a shift in how we address these issues. Rather than saying we need to go out and help this, it's more of, hey, these people are as equal to you as you are to me. We shouldn't just go and fix their situations. We should go there and ask them, what do you need from me? How can I serve you? How can I be assistance to what you need right now? Because when we usually, especially people in our higher power, we think of government officials, we think of anybody who's in management of any situation, they think of how to fix those issues. How do we fix it so it's running more smoothly? How do we make it so we solve these issues? Because those people can't. They can't solve it themselves. That's another part of it. It may not be said that they can't solve it, but by saying that I need to go in and solve it, you're basically saying, well, they're incapable of solving it themselves, and I have a better position to know how. When really, it's because the conditions that they have are less or are kind of blocked off than the ones that you might have. And so it's kind of important to reframe it as that. Um,
Well, it's really because it's about finding, it's about meeting people where they're at. You know what I mean? Because everybody, there's this old organizing idea that you go from the people to the people, right? Where you take the unsystematized kind of general ideas that you hear from people on the ground, and it's kind of like, okay, everybody knows our government is corrupt, so like, what are we going to do about it? Like, everybody knows these sweeps don't work, so what are we going to do about it? Like, what is the fundamental slogan and idea that the people have around, that the people have, like, what are the fundamental ideas and solutions that people have? And most folks that want people to just be left alone. That's why stop the sweeps is an excellent slogan, because it's like, everybody knows these don't work, so what do we do? It's like, hey, we should just stop doing that and stop wasting the money. The idea of housing first or housing now, like housing for all, it's really important to, like, everybody knows what we need, you know what I mean? It's about figuring out how to systematize those ideas as a community rather than imposing ideas from outside. It's about hearing what people have to say. And every group of people has those solutions on hand if you go and fucking talk to them, including houseless folks.
Yeah, and that's kind of a really important aspect. There are some theorists who say that if you want to kind of solve or really find solutions for certain issues, you have to look at the bottom. You have to ask the people who are the most marginalized, the people who are kind of the most affected by systemic abuses, and ask them what they think. And that's where we get kind of these intersectional ideas and intersectional thoughts of how not just how maybe a black person would think, maybe a woman would think, and how a disabled person would think, but rather combining those issues. How do they affect each other? How does a black woman face the world versus a disabled black woman? And those things are also like where the most marginalization is. So it's not just kind of being like, oh, well, how do we help them? But really, how do we kind of use the abilities that we have to to their advantage as well, to their support. And we as PHP try to focus on that by kind of meeting people where they're at, right? We go there and we try to build community. Um, we try to kind of personify these people that in a large case like the city of Portland is one of the worst whenever it comes to houselessness and homelessness, and they're kind of devaluing of human lives. They don't really offer what a lot of people kind of are trying to offer. There are organizations that offer cooling stations because of how many people will die from heat, but the city doesn't really offer those. The city doesn't even promote those. The city doesn't really care for those. Portland is focused on tourism, very importantly, focused on tourists and foodies and those kind of like exports, because that's where a lot of money comes from. There isn't really any money in housing houseless folk. There isn't really any money in these things. And even though they're government branches, they are government, and so they should be focused on kind of helping the people that they serve. They are helping the people who come and visit. They are helping the people who they don't really have to be accountable for whenever it comes to housing and basic rights.
Well, it's not, it's part of it is for the people who come here, but it's like a lot of it is for the people who live here who profit off the tourists. Like there's a
Yeah.
reason why the sweeps are so heavily focused in downtown, because it's like the hotels, the downtown restaurants, the people who donate to our politicians and keep getting them fucking reelected. These are the people who need the city's downtown to be doing well, who need it to be growing economically, who need it to be better than it was, and who can't have all this unsightly, like, homelessness all around, lowering property values.
Yeah.
So there's not like, it's an integrated problem because like, you know, these service organ, like the city is able to abdicate some of its responsibilities because like, just like the government, like one of the problems of the industrial complex is that it allows the government to fucking abdicate its responsibilities. It's like, oh, we don't have to worry about homelessness, there's charities that do that. Oh, we don't have to worry about like young queer kids on the street, there's charity, the Q Center will handle that. Like, they're able, it's a strategy by which the government is able to outsource the fixing of problems to public-private partnerships in a way that incorporates people's good work and goodwill into the logic of the system.
Yeah. And people generally, like the people who live in Portland, kind of just assume that they're being helped. Like, oh, well, if I don't see homeless people in front of me, then that means that they're getting help or that they're in the shelters. But we're really saying more people kind of live more scattered than anything. We're seeing people kind of be in worse conditions because it's out of sight, the government is kind of just okay with these things being out of sight, out of problem, because they don't necessarily want to be held accountable for fixing those issues. And that's why sweeping is much more just easier than actually kind of solving these issues, than actually kind of giving people structure or giving any assistance. They would prefer just to make them kind of leave, and that's obvious by the way they talk about it, and that's obvious by the actions that they're doing. And so, as a group, as kind of a collective of people, it's important that we not only focus on helping people kind of get a foot up, but we also value people for more than what the city values them, which is just kind of garbage that's on the side of the street that needs to be cleaned up. That's how they're treated when we think of sweeping them.
Yeah,
People,
and this is just the language itself. It's like, what else get, like, what do you sweep? Like, you sweep trash away, you sweep debris, you sweep dirt. You
yeah.
you never sweep. It's like, oh, I got to sweep together all these valuable diamonds. You know what I mean? It implies, like, the very fucking language that they use implies that the people are like the same as trash and debris.
Yeah. I don't know if any of you heard about there was a car part, the cattle. It was a very important car part.
I
Uh,
think it's a catalytic converter or
yeah,
something like
it's
that.
something like that. I'm not a car person. I take the max places. But there were these converters that were being taken out of cars, and a lot of people on apps like, you know, Facebook and Nextdoor, and just kind of general the vibe of Portland is to blame houseless folk. It's to blame people like, oh well, you're selling it for drugs, or you're selling it because you don't have anything, so you're willing to do anything. And recently, it was found out that that wasn't what was happening. What was happening was this ring of like high end crime, because if you think about it, if you actually think about the issue, who is buying those converters? If they are stealing them and then selling them, there's no place like part place, like official part place that would buy those. So why would they have this kind of idea of selling them? Like they're not like cans where you can go to any place and just put them in there. But they viewed them as already being criminal. They're already willing to do certain things for anything, so they might as well be doing these crimes. People would post about, oh, my broken window because of houseless folk, of homeless people, because they see immediately that, oh, well, there are people on the street, so they must be the ones doing it. Um, and even as we get this news, people aren't changing their narrative. They're not like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I thought it was house people. I can't believe I thought it was homeless people. I'm like, I have to reevaluate my everything. They just didn't care. They didn't care to change that rhetoric. They didn't even care to kind of be like, oh, I was wrong. They still kind of say, they're like, well, you know, criminals are basically, because they conflate the two, right? They conflate both of these things because they devalue that group, because that group has less, and that kind of goes with poverty, that goes with kind of the idea of being impoverished. And so, you know, we as a collective have to try to build people up so that they aren't kind of the bottom of society. And a big part of what our organization does is kind of help these groups, well, not groups, but like camps be more sightly, because um well, not sightly, but also what is it called, we
I would describe them as fundamentally improved in aesthetic and sanitation, because the reality
aesthetic
is
and
that
sanitation.
like houseless folks often live in camps that are the size of small apartment complexes. And if you think about how fucking full the dumpster outside your 8 to 20 person apartment complex gets on a weekly basis, I want you to imagine like what all of y'all's collective trash would look like if it was just piled up in front of the apartment complex without a dumpster, and how long it would take before it was like a giant apocalyptic pile that resembled a houseless camp. Because the truth is, it takes like a week. It really does not take that long for trash to pile up, especially when you don't have like good cooking implements and everything you buy is like use and throw away because you're out on the streets and you don't have a fucking kitchen. So like all of that is to say that like when you like part of what we're trying to do is like, because what people talk about is needing services. They're like, man, we need somebody to take this trash away. They're like, man, we need somewhere safe to sleep. And when you hear that from people, it's like, okay, well, what is the best, like, what are the things like they're like, we need medicine. And it's like, okay, well, unfortunately, like we don't own a pharmacy or a hospital. So like, what is within our capacity? Like, what are the needs that they have that's within our capacity to do? And how can we build a collective organization that has the power to channel the people with and organize the people with those skills to expand on the number of services and like needs of theirs that they tell us they want us to meet, that we can meet collectively. Because the truth is, like, the folks out on the street know what they need and want. They frequently just lack the access to capital or even what I
Services.
would call societal give a fuck to get access to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, basic utilities. Think about the things that are most provided: water, trash, garbage. Those
Toilets.
toilets. Yeah, those things are fundamentally, we don't really think about them as much as like we should, because those things are denied to those who have arguably less. People kind of say like, well, you know, uh, even just street, like even just street trash cans, they are usually unmanaged. Even street benches, what we would consider like public relaxing places, usually involve anti-homeless architecture. Um, and there's even like a number of hostile people towards kind of just houses people. They're just hostile because we've had this like rhetoric. And so if we want to focus on collective and building up, we do focus on kind of the bottom of houselessness. There's kind of like a trajectory of how people kind of get there. There, people who are houseless aren't necessarily always on the streets. That's usually where people will end up. There are many ways to kind of curb that, and we have very little access to those things. When people still have jobs but they live in their car, it becomes harder and harder to keep that job in the car. But you would assume that there would be assistance for that, of like, well, they're still working, so shouldn't we help them? There's less of that. So people kind of end up at the bottom, and that's where we're starting. We're starting from the bottom up. And that's something that we have to also remind people, is that people don't just end up on the street. People go through the process of ending up on the street. They go through the process of like, well, I used to have a storage unit, but then I didn't have enough money to take care of that. Or I used to couch hop, but then I didn't have anybody who would take me in anymore. They just say that like, I just need a little bit of time. I just need a little bit of support. And it's really hard to get that, even if you consider the services that we have are limited, and they're usually waiting periods, right? If you try to get any assistance of like, oh, I lost my job, I need assistance, I got fired, there's weeks of time apart, and people who are living paycheck to paycheck don't have that time. And as the growing number of people are living paycheck to paycheck, we are getting more people who are going to be on the streets. We're getting more people, more numbers of locals who are going to have to either leave or live under this poverty line that kind of Portland is, and largely America is kind of creating. Uh, and it's really hard to kind of think of in the grand scheme of like, how can I help, of what can I do? And it's about taking care of yourself, and it's about doing what you can as in like a sustainable way, right? Doing something that you can consistently do, providing something that you can consistently provide, being like, okay, I'm going to commit to this, and not just committing to it because you want to feel better or because you feel like it's a good thing to do, but rather because you see those people as a Portland, like as part of Portland. You see those people as the locals who have value. You don't just go there and fix up the camp and leave. You ask them about themselves, about their life, about like who they are as a person. You ask the same questions that you would ask somebody that you truly care about, because it's about building those connections. And even if you aren't in-depth best friends, you're still kind of valuing the things that they share. And that in part is kind of how you make people feel like they matter. Going to somebody's house and cleaning it and then leaving is just kind of doing a service that won't leave an impression. But sitting with them and actually being a person with them and saying like, hey, I'm coming here not just because I want to, fix this because like I feel like it's an issue and we have to fix it, but because I see you as a person and I see the system that I can't change by myself and you can't change by yourself, as a problem. And I think that together we can at least build something. With as much people, we can at least build something together that can improve the conditions that we have, because we're all living in the conditions of capitalism. Um, and understanding that is kind of helps understand people, you know, meet people where they're at and kind of start seeing them as people.
Yeah, and I think one of the other big things is that like, because I think that's a very it has to happen on two levels, right? That, because I think Cameron, I think one of the things you just touched on that I really appreciate is like that consistency of like everybody needs to be able to do what they can do sustainably so they don't burn themselves out on trying to fucking build a better world. And at the same time, I think on like a collective level, I think that's part of what we're trying to do. Part of what we're trying to do with PHP is build organizations that can have enough like economic, political, and ideological power to like help sustain the movement, because there are people who are working full time to keep the capitalist system propped up. And the only way it's going to come down is if people who are like can invest their full time in trying to bring it down, in trying to build the alternative world. Um, and being community funded makes it harder to do that, but it's also what keeps us independent from those fucking foundations and that entire 501c3 system that depoliticizes and de-radicalizes organizations. So no matter where you are at in this like city or in this like state or world, like if it is not with the people's housing project, like join an organization or start one, because we need to have engines that help facilitate consistency.
Yeah. A big part of this is also just seeing the fight as the same fight, seeing kind of the issues as the same issues. Um, you know, when people talk about like these issues of social change, we talk about privilege as like a sense of like, oh, well, you have white privilege. There's also economic privileges that we kind of don't touch on because they're much more fluid. It's much more of a fluid of privilege that's not kind of a constant. But your economic stability is a privilege that you should kind of try your best to exploit. You should try to use it as much as you can. You know, that's why we tell people, that's why we ask people who have money for money. We don't really ask people who do not have it. We ask for support for those who can give it because they can give it, and not just from anybody or everybody because not everybody can. And we kind of accept that. We accept what people can give, and we don't really judge people for either how little or how much. You know, like, oh, well, if you can give this much, then why not give more? We try to appreciate people where they're at. And right now, you know, we're trying to build a community of people who we are invested in. Um, things are going to get just kind of harder because later stage capitalism is going to get worse. And having people that you can rely on is important, especially as like these issues kind of become more aggressive. These people who want to push the hegemonic ideology become more violent. You want there to be defenses and you want there to be structure. Um, and so that's kind of a big part of community building, is trying to maintain that structure and trying to maintain a consistency of you can rely on me for this to support you. And as like a group, that's what we're trying to do, right? Yeah. One of the big things that like goes into volunteerism is the idea of a consumption nature and an individualistic nature. Although these advertisements for volunteering show this glamorized, marketed of you're helping a cause and you're helping, it's still individualized. Even if you make friends through volunteering, it's still you do this for this. And that goes into the exchange within consumption and capitalism of you do it for this maybe, or you do it for this. And so it's kind of trying to pull away from that. We're pulling both away from consumption and individualism. And those are very hard things to pull away from because they are ingrained in our society. Uh, you know, they're ingrained for you to need a thing and buy it rather than trying to find a different solution or trying to ask somebody near you. Asking people near you isn't really even an option, but we're trying to build it to where that is an option. We're trying to make it to where you are upheld by your community and you uphold your community with together. That's a little weirdly stated. Um, does anybody have anything they want to add? Open for additions.
Tell us all your thoughts and feelings and questions.
Yeah, hi there. So can you hear me? Okay. So yeah, I think you know, part of all this is people have to reach the emotional maturity to figure out how to deal with this stuff. And I mean, I've been realizing in the last few years, and I'm 52, and you know, I think this is something that hits a lot of us at middle age, is that we do not know how to deal with emotions. And we don't know how much community and connection is important to us as humans. And I think that a lot of people are just too young to get it. You know, I really think that this is something that it's something that people sort of start looking at once they get a little bit older. I mean, I sure as hell wouldn't have gotten it back when I was in my 20s or 30s. And I don't know, you know, how many other people do get it. You know, obviously people have decided their route through life. by the time they're my age, and they either become one of the people who has money and who has a lot of these really nice things to be able to live life, or there are people who don't have any of this stuff, but they don't necessarily have time to sit down and look and see what it is that makes us human and how to help each other. I'm really looking at trying to interact more with neighbors and with my friends and just support each other without having to just like, okay, skip over money, skip over government, just avoid all that shit. And, just take care of each other where we are. Anyway, so yeah, yeah. And another thing we've been talking about, so my friends and I, is where it is that humans lost their ability to deal with emotions. And some of us are saying, well, it was 10,000 years ago when we started agriculture and people stopped living in these plans. Or some other friends are saying, well, it started actually back about 200 years ago with the Industrial Revolution. And I don't know when it started, but it's a major concern that people just don't think about how to help each other. And we're all isolated and we're all individuals. And, you guys mentioned losing individuality. That's very important, I think, because we are taught to be individuals. And if we can get rid of that, it's really going to help a lot of people, I think. Anyway, so that's my thoughts.
I love that point. That's a very really interesting kind of perspective. To be kind of saying this emotional kind of thing on both an individual scale of when people kind of age, and also on a social scale where people kind of started to think less about this emotional capacity. And I think that if you really kind of consider the structure of within capitalism, and capitalism started way back when, and we can go through the stages of which it kind of did things, right? But we've kind of structured this power system to kind of be on this capital. And how do you make capital in the system? It's usually by being number one, by climbing over people, and by kind of really keeping people down for it, right?
Yeah.
If you want to bring up kind of the economic booms
it's the competition of the market. The market decides who's best, and if you're not best, fuck you. So you have a constant incentive to undermine your competitors, your coworkers, because it's you don't get promoted based on whether your coworkers vote you the hardest worker. You get promoted based on whether the boss likes you.
Yep.
Yeah. So really,
there are all
this
the tendencies towards individual atomization. So
yeah,
go ahead.
I was gonna say kind of this divestment in collaboration, right? We don't all rise. It's, well, I rise as long as I can keep other people down. And we kind of get this systemic kind of oppressions as well. If we can keep one group segregated, then this group has a better chance of winning. And that's kind of the game we've played, of this winning game.
Yeah.
But
and so now it's a large part of it. I mean, it's all the oppression of women. It's what the Supreme Court is doing. It's it's all this stuff, which I mean, if you look at human evolution, I do think that it probably did start 10,000 years ago, back when we started becoming landowners, and somebody had to rise up and somebody had to sink down. And I think it's been downhill since then.
And there's plenty of other cultures as well, that kind of we've learned through history that people were oh, well, they were less civilized, right? So we learned that certain tribes of the Americas were less civilized. And we kind of measure it based on this materialism of well, they weren't using guns, so were they really better? But in a lot of these societies and that were conquered during that time, they had a more of a focus on social interactions. They had more of a focus on collaborative affairs.
Right.
And
their
yeah, and their agriculture was much different too. They did do agriculture, but they would have things like, I'm sure all of you kind of heard of like this popular one that's kind of resurfacing of the Three Sisters, where it wasn't a monoculture as we saw kind of throughout Europe, but a culture that kind of fed into the plants helped each other. So that instead of, as you might know with agriculture, monocultures kind of take from the land and you have to plant a new thing. And it's really hard to kind of have a sustainable plan. But with the Three Sisters, it's very sustainable because it's throughout the year you plant a different one and it helps the other one grow. But like this colonization that fed into the kind of rise of capitalism, because people were kind of being like, well, why should I do my work for the king whenever I have more money now? And kind of they de-invested in this serfdom and created a new serfdom that was based on profit. And so seeing other cultures that valued like, oh, well, they value each other or they value their kids. A lot of Aboriginal Australian cultures, they did a lot of, most of their kind of focus was on their children, and both parents would put a lot into their children. And they didn't have this very hierarchical kind of family structure. They laughed at that. They mocked that. A lot of like European colonizers would do that. So right now we're kind of getting voices from different communities who are less invested in these hierarchies, in these kind of oppression of like women, but we're also getting people who are more, right? They're more rampant on like, well, no, we have to oppress women harder for there to be a better thing. So we're getting this polarization.
Yeah.
Hi. I just want to say I appreciate this conversation a lot, and I'm just very much reflecting on it, especially as someone who has spent most of my youth sort of going to different front lines and different resistance camps and stuff. And I'm really seeing how over the years that takes such a big toll. Because while it's not like, you know, like these camps and different front lines, like they're not nonprofits, it's not necessarily organizations that are doing it, but at the same time, I've been seeing how that mindset of volunteerism can kick in, and where there isn't that community building, where we sort of gather when we want to and when we can, when we have the resources to it, and like do what we can. But then at the end of it, just what I've seen over and over and over is it feels like there's such a lack of community, and all we're left with is like the aftermath and the rubble and people's overflowing trauma, and then the infighting that comes with that trauma. And it's just so, it's so difficult to navigate. And yeah, that's just something I'm thinking a lot about, is how do we build community with people who did not grow up knowing what community is, and with people who come from backgrounds and lineages where that community was broken and disrupted and traumatized. And I just, yeah, I don't know. That's just something I've been thinking a lot about, because it's hard, and it's hard when there's very few people who are trying to build that community and hold that up when others don't really understand it. And I also like want to recognize and like have the compassion that like it's on purpose that a lot of us don't know what community is, and that a lot of us don't know how to build that and hold that. And so yeah, I don't know. I just want to like brainstorm ways and maybe talk about ways of how we do build that community, and like how we do open that mindset and plant those seeds so that we can practice community and also have the compassion when we do mess up, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, but yeah, again, I just, yeah, really appreciate this conversation, and I really appreciate the point of how community takes commitment, and it's not like we can just show up when we want to, because that's not really community. And I just, yeah, I just really appreciate that, and I've been thinking about how that pertains to a lot of different front lines where it just seems like people show up when they can, which I get it, but also when they want to, and then not a lot gets done, and we're just left with the aftermath of trauma. pretty much, because there isn't that commitment.
Yeah. That's a great kind of like point about kind of community building. How do we that have been fed ideology for so long, right? You're fed this you know Eurocentric history, and that's easy to kind of know, but you're also taught this individualism, and you're taught about kind of this like the ideals of capitalism and how they're good, and when you start to see that they're bad, well, where do you go from there if you've never experienced that? If you've never experienced a community, how do you start a community? How do you know how to do conflict resolution? How do you know how to or when to kind of set boundaries and what boundaries to set? And like if they're for you. We have this understanding of selfishness as a like a bad thing, right? It's bad to be selfish. And in a lot of ways, that kind of hurts marginalized people most. Think about the most people who are told that they're selfish. It's women. And it's people who are told to like, well, you need to put your side, your feelings and yourself aside for the better good, for the greater good. And this greater good is largely the systems that we're devoted to of capitalism. So a big part of that community building is kind of knowing yourself, and a lot of people don't know themselves. A lot of people don't spend time to know themselves, to kind of figure out like, well, what do I need as a structure? What do I need as a community? And kind of they'll give themselves all. Like when we see these like resistance and these protests, we see people giving as much as they can really fast, and that's not sustainable, right? You get this huge burst of energy, but we need more than a burst of energy. We need a consistent energy. And it's really hard to have that, especially if you have other problems, if you have other things like, well, I'd love to be on the streets, kind of protesting this thing, but I have this job and I have this like, especially if you have a kid, there's nobody helping you with that kid. But with community building, if you had somebody who's like, okay, all of you are going to collect to do a thing, this one person who isn't going to protest is instead going to watch everybody's kid. What if we had that for people who were parents, and wanted to do an issue? That kind of community that was really big whenever it came to like the 1960s of civil rights
Yep,
isn't
the
really
Panthers
there.
had that.
Panthers had that. People had that. People had these ideas of like, hey, we're all, and these like strikes that people are kind of doing of like one day. Strikes can't be one day. Strikes have to be over several days, several months. People are on strikes, and people can't really think of ever doing that because society and largely capitalism has gotten so strong that you'll lose so much more for maybe the idea of getting something. So that's why we kind of are focusing less on this idea of like, well, we have to do this like huge thing for as long as we can because it's not as feasible. So we have to change the way that we do things. And a large way of changing that is like you're seeing the idea of like quiet quitting, when really it's people being like, I understand that I can't do the hustle. I can't do the grind anymore because I'm giving too much and I'm not really getting anything. They're calling that quiet quitting, but really it's people being like, no, I just don't want to participate in wage theft, in me giving all and not getting as much as I'm giving. Why would I do that? And that's a huge thing. That's an internal thing. That's a thing that everybody has to start doing of like, no, you're giving me the bare minimum. So why shouldn't I give you the bare minimum? Um, and like starting in those ideas of being like, well, of not doing consumerism, right? That's a really hard one too, of being like, okay, well, I'm instead going to do garage sales, because even thrift stores are kind of feeding into like the ideals of capitalism of like making a capital based on that. So it's like harder, but it's in different ways of like creating a resistance, not through this violence of participating, but it still has the roots of not participating in the system that wants you to participate in it. Dave.
Yes, thank you. This is my brain just like going and going. Everybody's making such really good points. And Christine, I appreciate bringing up like kind of the emotional depth component. And Rabbit, I like very relate to everything you're saying. I've seen the like putting the thing, the adrenaline to trauma pipeline. Like I have just kind of personally seen what I think is kind of like a martyr complex. Right? I think there's a level where it's like there's kind of a rush to be able to try and be a savior and then lose, because you kind of just get to like not take on too much responsibility because you just show up during the trauma, you do what you can, you get traumatized too, then leave. And I think it's a really good question. Like, what does it mean to build community? Something that's been on my mind a lot. And I think I don't really know, but I know that I think one part of it is it just takes like time. It's like you're saying, like we live in a society, or most of us live in a society that really rewards like not developing those types of connections. And I've compared it to dating where it's like, I'm just looking for love. And it's like, well, love is a thing that takes like years to develop. And I think that's kind of where we're at with like community, where it's like, there's not really any shortcuts. Community is what happens with like an interconnected group of people who have like a reliance of, I would even say kind of like survival. You know, it's like, I trust you to some degree with my life or some part of my life. And I think in some ways, like unhoused folks like can have those senses of community. It's like, okay, you got my back or I die. I got your back or you die. You know, and I think as we continue to enter these later stages of capitalism, as Cameron's pointing out, it's like right now, the average person, I don't have a lot of my life in their hands. You know, and once you start to really have that, at least like here in PHP, it's like in some cases, like our lives are kind of in each other's hands, doing different this or that, or during the protest. Another example, it's like some of those I did feel the most community because it's like, I might not get out of this tear gas if it wasn't for you, but I don't even know who you are, you know? And I do think it's like commitment and consistency because it just, you have to work at it because we just kind of don't have community. We have the word a lot more than we have like the concept. So yeah, I wish I had like here's how you do community, but I just appreciate everyone's insight. This is like really fascinating and hard question that I think is the biggest make or break for movements is, do you inspire people to feel like they want to be with you? Because like in a revolutionary movement, you're asking people to potentially like die or shed their blood. You know, the things that we do, the levels we have to get for the world we want to see are high commitment. And do people feel like you really have their back? And do they want to be here? I think we also have to have dancing. And that would be my last thought.
No, yeah, that form of celebration is kind of needed on a very personal way of needing people to need you. As we become alienated or atomized by the society that we're in, we don't feel like we're needed. At work, you're told kind of you're replaceable. Your parents are like, well, you're out by 18, or some people might not have great connections with their parents. And there's like less and less support by our greater society. So kind of like celebrating each other is also a really big one. Celebrating like, hey, you showed up and you impacted me by doing that, is a really huge thing that we kind of need as well. Of like, I'll die for you, but also I'm simply happy that you're here with me. That value in people, that value on um, a smaller scale, an interpersonal scale, is also very vital. Whenever it comes to that like consistency, that commitment, we usually are committed by people who are also holding us accountable, right? You have somebody message you, reach out to you to be like, hey, um, you didn't show up. Are you okay? People who are looking out for you not because you are supposed to, because you have to give yourself, but rather if you're not there, they're also concerned about like, hey, you're a part of this. And without you, it feels like there's lacking something because you make it a whole. And it's like this growing whole, this growing thing that's supposed to continue to have people. But as we kind of form these communities, it feels like, well, if somebody leaves, it's not really a big deal, and that's hard to feel like you're important if you just leave and it's not really a big deal. So kind of a big part of that is celebrating people for their individualism. Having individualism in a collective is very important because we want to feel unique, we want to feel special. Capitalism really pulls from that, right? That feeling of needing to be unique and special to people. We don't want to be like, even whenever you hear them harp against communism, it's because they're ununique, they're all one people. No, a big thing with community building is also seeing people for their very unique abilities, the one things that they can do, and then seeing yourself for the one things that you can do. Like, hey, I might have this weakness, but I can do this. You know, that is how we also build these sustainable routes of being different plants that do different things that need different things. Um, and that's kind of how we build a collective that encompasses more people. Um, that it's not just needs driven, but like, hey, I can do this because I want to do this because it makes me feel important. Um, and that's like another thing of like volunteerism. You're kind of just taught to be a volunteer. You do a very basic job, and you're replaceable. How is that a community? If you're asked, like in PHP, we try to find people to do very specific jobs. We try to find people to do very specific, like, okay, we need somebody who knows how to fix a cart because we don't know how to do that. We might have a little collective, but we don't know how to do that. So kind of like trying to find people to fit into that is also very important. And the trauma is also incredibly important. People are traumatized. Not only are they traumatized usually by their childhood, because childhoods are very up and down right now. People are like coming out being like, "Hey, my parents, I don't think they know how to do emotions. Uh, I'm coming out traumatized." But also society. You come out of school being like, "I was told everything would work out. Things aren't working out." Poverty is extremely traumatizing of being constantly stressed. This perpetuation, we're in this debtor economy. Like you're supposed to just get debt. Debt's extremely stressful. A living paycheck to paycheck, that's extremely stressful. Stress is the precursor of like that mental strain. Stress is one of those huge issues that we kind of downplay, right? You're like a little stressed out, whatever. But if you're continually, perpetually under heavy amounts of stress, that forms itself into actual harm of your body. Um, and like we don't really know all the time how to relieve stress because we're not really taught that. We're taught you're just supposed to be stressed out. You're just supposed to be, you're stressed out and then I don't know, you watch some TV, you do some consumerism. So we learn, as well as being heavily under stress, that the way to de-stress is to do consumerism. And so focusing on community is also trying to be like, hey, rather than having community as a thing of like, oh, well, that's another stress because I have to build a community. I have to put active thing. Having passive, having it be like, okay, I'm going to go hang out in my community. I'm going to go just be. And that being okay as well. A lot of these like spaces, a lot of this thing is like, oh, well, we need you to do this. You have to do this active thing. And it's very tiring. People are exhausted. And we understand that people are exhausted. And so it's kind of having that grace for yourself of being like, I want to be with my community, but I don't want to do anything. I don't want to do anything. I want to just sit with people, talk about stupid shit, um, share a meme or two, and I want that to be my life. And that's a very important thing about that passive community of being able to sit with people. But people are like we're taught that we need to have that productivity. Okay, bye, Katie. That we need to have that productivity constantly. That it even comes in the revolutionary actions. That we need to have productivity in revolutionary actions. If we're not getting change, if we're not getting huge change, then all of this is worthless. When that's not true, because you're affecting people. Even if you don't get the change that you wanted, you're affecting the people around you. And focusing on that is going to make more sustainable change, more constant of being like, well, I tried that, it didn't do anything, so I stopped. That's not sustainable. That's not, you're not going to get anywhere, you know? So you want to continue to give that care, to give that, like, okay, I'm going to try. Um, it goes into that, like, people not wanting to do things that maybe they fail at, uh, wanting to try again, kind of that constant persistent of like, okay, right now I've never done this. So instead of putting all of it in there and then kind of being super disappointed, I'm going to give a little bit. If it works out, then I'll give a little more. If it doesn't work out, I'll try again in a little bit, right? Giving yourself those steps, letting yourself kind of um, build up to those things. You don't have to be on the streets to kind of have a participation in these things. You can kind of just build yourself up in a system that wants to break you down is revolutionary, especially if you're part of a marginalized group, especially if you're kind of a group that they want to push down. Um, if you can feel like you're okay and try to kind of subvert that trauma, it's revolutionary. And that's a really important thing, is that those small things, those small steps add up. If you give up after trying to make a big step, it's not going to add up. You need those persistent small steps. And that's what community building is also about. It's about that persistent, no, consistent small steps to really kind of make a group. Yay. Does anybody have anything else they would love to bring up? I'm loving this.
Just something I remembered that I heard from another friend this week, in regards to like stress and the mental strain that it takes on us, is people who are in chess tournaments, like longer chess tournaments, will often lose 20 pounds from how much they are thinking. Because when I'm trying to remember how my friend put this into words, because when we're stressed out or like using a lot of our brains, like it takes up so much more energy than we're aware of. Like even though physically we might not be doing much, just that mental strain really, really eats up that energy. And I've just been thinking about that a lot, and just like questioning how we're nourishing ourselves too, so that we aren't getting so burnt out just stressing about things, and just learning about what's going on in the world and dealing with their everyday lives. Like we really, yeah, we really need to like care for ourselves and nourish ourselves as much as we can, so that we can be balanced and present and show up for others as well.
Yeah. And think about how people kind of respond to anger, right? If you're more kind of, if you're more emotionally unstable or more like emotionally unbalanced, you're going to kind of react poorly to anybody saying anything to you. You're going to have a more negative adverse effect. You might take it a little more personally. But if you can have a strong sense of self, um, you can have a better response to somebody calling you anything, to somebody saying anything to you. Be like, okay, that's more of a you problem than it is me. But that's really hard if you don't develop that kind of concrete self. And people are not encouraged to form a self. They're not encouraged to form an individual that is substantially your own, because you have to fit into so many boxes in order to get ahead. That's what you're told, right? So it's important to kind of start to know yourself, to know your limitations, and to know your value, in order to kind of construct a valuable organization or a valuable just collective community. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like one of the things I've been reading this book called Braiding Sweet Grass, which is like a book about indigenous knowledge, scientific knowledge, and natural knowledge. And one of the things they talk about is like reciprocity economies, right? Because it's like when you buy something, the transaction's over. That's like the end of the thing. You like make this connection around the exchange of money and then it's over. But reciprocity, it's like when you give somebody a gift, like there's a connection that goes to that, and it creates this mutual obligation. And a lot of times, because we're not raised in that culture, mutual obligation feels very scary to us. You know what I mean? But we need to kind of lean into that. I think that is a thought that I've had. I'm only like 4 chapters into this book, but that is one of the thoughts I've had so far.
That's farther than I have gotten in the book, because I have that book, but I have not read it because I'm bad at
So
reading.
if you can hear it on audiobook, it's read by the author and it's really nicely done. So it's available. I'm over in Hillsborough, and I know it's available at the Washington County libraries. I don't know if it is, Multnomah, but anyway, yeah.
We should have a whole event on libraries. Libraries. Go to them. Go to a library.
It's a lot cheaper than paying Vudu every time you want to watch a movie.
That's right. Uh, that's a great point. Like these transactions are like an end at like the money, and then like, and sometimes you shop online. Those smaller shops are usually like they send those personal messages that are like, "Yo, thank you so much for buying this." But you buy something off of like Amazon, it's like, "Hey, can you give us some stars? Can you give us a rating so we can get more customers?" I keep like most of the handwritten stuff that I'll get from people who I buy. Like I like their little art. I love buying art from people because I'm like, ah, you made this. Give me that. And they'll always like, I appreciate you. I wouldn't be able to kind of have a living if it weren't for people buying my art. And that's kind of like a focus on Portland that we can also kind of try to amplify, right? We can try to be like, hey, um, when you buy local, buy small stuff, buy like local, Powell's is local, but it's huge. All right, it's huge. Go to a smaller bookstore. There's smaller bookstores. Go to them. Okay, it's got 4 stories, sure, but go to a smaller bookstore. It's getting all the tourists. Okay, you don't need to go there. So it's like thinking of those people who are because starting a small business is really, really hard. So if you can kind of like try to build a little repertoire of like, hey, I love your stuff. That's also good. Um, that's it from me. Yeah. We have like a few more minutes if anybody wants to say anything. If you guys want to get in touch with our organization, you can Instagram message. I love getting Instagram messages. I reply to them, so they're coming to. Okay, I don't reply to all of them, but I will probably see it and I'll appreciate it. So if you guys want to build a repertoire, be friends, community building with friends, I would look for. We would look forward to that. We host other events. This is just like an easy one that you don't really have to go anywhere to. I hate going places, so uh but we do other things. So I encourage all of you to look at the other things that we do because they're cool. um you know but that's it. Thank you so much for all of you like engaging. Loved that. Being here, also loved that. Really appreciate it. Crazy appreciate it. And thank you.
So yeah, and then next week we'll be doing another one of these community conversations. It'll be starting at 6:30 instead of 7, and it'll go from 6:30 to 8. It's going to be on Black August, George Jackson, and kind of what we can learn from him as an activist, and why it's important what we choose to memorialize historically. If you like the work we are doing and want to support these community conversations, PHP is entirely grassroots funded. Like we don't take any corporate or government money. So all of this happens because people like y'all pitch in. So you can sign up through our Patreon, which Cameron, if you're on your laptop, if you could copy and paste from our meetup into the chat. Because yeah, at the end of the day, like this, like all of our work happens because people pitch in. So if I can thank you all, because it's going to take from all of us working, giving according to our ability and getting according to our need in order to keep ourselves sane and in this movement. So much love to everyone. Oh, and if you want to volunteer, we are cleaning up, doing cleaning at a houseless camp on Sunday. So yeah, come out. It's on the same meetup that you found this through. So hopefully we will see you there.
Yep. Thank you guys so much. Hope to see you in more places with this organization because it's the one that I participate in.